All right, so I've got Bryan Dyer here, and we are live streaming this. It's about salvation by allegiance alone, but I just wanted to give some of the background to those who are watching the live stream. We are going to splice this together with my interview with Matthew Bates. So this is kind of the raw form of what we're doing, but we're looking at this piece of the story. So start with, if you would, your name, what you do, and where you live.
Right. Bryan Dyer. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I work for Baker Publishing Group. Currently the senior acquisitions editor. I primarily do New Testament, biblical languages, early Christianity, um, those types of books.
And so are you the senior acquisitions editor for Baker Academic or just Baker?
Right. Yeah, Baker Academic.
Okay.
Uh, just about all of my acquisitions fall into academic. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for making time for this. So tell
Yeah.
me the story of Salvation by Allegiance Alone by Matthew Bates from your perspective.
Right. Well, it's kind of interesting because I actually first encountered the project when I was working in marketing. So this would have been way back in 2015. I was the marketing director for Baker Academic. And so I was originally looking at it from kind of the publicity marketing side of
Recording in
things.
progress.
Um, okay, I started with or I first approached the book through the marketing lens because I was the director of marketing at the time. My colleague James Ernest, who's now editor in chief over at Erdman's, originally brought the project in because he was in the role that I'm in now. Um, yeah, so I would have been there when we talked about it in our pub board in some of those early conversations. But then in 2015, James moved over to Erdman's and I transitioned into this role. And so I inherited the book after it had been acquired. So I worked with Matt once he had a manuscript and then did some revisions with him. And so I picked it up at that point and all the other stuff that goes into the editorial process at that stage. James Ernest. Yep. I I can't remember. He might have had some back and forth with Matt, but typically we'll acquire a book and there may be some interaction, but then once they have a full manuscript, then I'm really kind of digging into it and giving some feedback before I eventually hand it off to my editorial team. And I remember with this one, there was quite a bit of back and forth on it. I mean, I can talk about some of the things that we talked about at that stage. But yeah, James originally brought it in, and then I kind of brought it home, I guess would be the way to describe it. Right. Right. So I originally started at Baker in 2011 when I was a PhD student. I studied at McMaster Divinity in Ontario, and I had finished my coursework and my comps and was looking to move back into the States and kind of stumbled into a job doing marketing and publicity for Baker Academic. I mean, it was great. It was, a PhD student's dream. You get to get a bunch of books and talk to a bunch of people you admire and go to conferences. Um, but once I finished the degree, I kind of knew I wanted to move into editorial. So it kind of just happened that the year I finished was the year that this job opened up. And so I moved over and I've been doing that now for about 8 or 9 years, doing the editorial side.
Uh,
Yeah, but
th- that,
it's different ways of looking at a book, right? When you're looking at it from marketing, you're trying to think who's the audience and will it sell and how do we pitch it and those types of things. Um and you still think about those things in editorial, but when you're shifting, now you're looking at the strength of the argument and the prose and the flow of it and the interlocutors and all that kind of stuff. So it was kind of two different ways of looking at it.
yeah, but I think that, I run a publishing company, and so I do the marketing, I do editorial depending on the day.
Yeah.
But I think you actually bring a lot of value to the Baker academic table when you can like dance with the marketing side of things by
Right.
direct experience, you know.
Right.
Um, when you were on the marketing team and you saw this come across the table, do you remember what you thought of it then?
Yeah, I do remember, and I was reflecting on this a little bit. I remember that there was a lot of enthusiasm about the project. I know that there was some discussion at the pub board simply about this was a big um, this was a big argument, and it was a potentially kind of changing or challenging a lot of um, ideas about justification and how to interpret pistis and those types of things. And I remember there was some like Matt Bates was still pretty early in his career. He had, I think, his dissertation out, and his Oxford book I don't think had come out yet. So there was some discussion of um, will people listen to him
Like who
because
is he? Yeah.
he's a pretty junior scholar. And as we're looking at the project, the comparable books that were out there was Scott McKnight, N.T. Wright, who had kind of talked about some of these the whole thing, the oh, now I'm blanking on the McKnight one, but
Oh,
the King
is it
Jesus Gospel
King
or
Jesus
something like
Gospel?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it was kind of in that same orbit, but those are titans, right? They're senior people, and so we had some discussion about Matt Bates's platform at that point. Now, of course, we can look back now and see how it took off and how Matt has published quite a bit in this area and become a recognized
It's all
voice.
because of you, man. It's all because of
It's
you.
it's but at the time that wasn't clear. But we knew we had an interesting argument, potentially paradigm shifting. I know we had a discussion about, we all loved the title, Salvation by Allegiance Alone. I mean, it communicated pretty quickly what it was, and
Okay, so was that his
um,
title then, or did you guys help him form that?
I think it came to us with that title. Now, it could be that James and Matt had some conversations before I would have seen it at our pub board, but by the time it came to our pub board, it had that title on it. And I think we saw that as a pretty strong hook, right? When you have a title that
100%.
that
Yeah.
there's a lot of books that you have a hard time titling, but that one seemed to kind of get at it right away. And I think, I mean, I do think that really helped the success of it, is that Matt was able to kind of zero in on, this is the argument that I'm making. And if I seem to recall, the thing that Matt was doing that was different from like Scott McKnight or N.T. Wright is he was really putting in the foreground the translation of pistis and rethinking in terms of allegiance. And so he was putting that front and center. And I think that is something that people can connect with right away, or at least it's provocative enough where they'll want to read it. And so I think that contributed to the success as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was 2015, so I'm trying to remember what I was thinking, but that's
What were
my
you thinking?
recollection.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, totally, man. But I mean, so when you did your first edit, um,
Right.
you had seeing it across the pub board is one thing, but when you did your first edit, what was that like?
Right.
Like what? Obviously, it's like okay, this can go to market. We think that there's a hook. But what was your impression when you first read it?
Right. Well, I remember two things about that. Um, as my job inheriting this book as the editor, I remember thinking I need to get it to an outside reader, and I need to get somebody who is kind of a senior person. It's a blind review, so I'll keep that identity a secret, but I kind of wanted to see how it would play with somebody who is in these conversations. And so did that. I thought was an important piece. I
Who'd
remember
you
it,
who'd
it
you
was
send it to?
well, I should probably keep that confidential because it's technically a blind review.
Oh,
But
like you still can't talk about who. What isn't that just for the editorial effect?
I should probably confirm with them.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't. Um, but I thought that was an important piece. And when their response was, they had some ideas for tweaks, but overall, they thought it was an argument that held water and thought it was strong. That gave me a lot of confidence with it. my own reading of it, I remember it was really long. And Matt, from my recollection, he's making this argument, and kind of the way Matt's mind works, I think, is he can foresee some like objections to his argument that he wants to address now. And we did a lot of work of trying to trim it down. And I think a lot of that extra material ended up being the follow-up books that he's done, the Gospel Allegiance and Why the Gospel, where he's fleshing out a bit of the implications of the argument.
That's really interesting. So I just checked the trim size again. It's 6 by 9, and
Right.
I talked about it with him because he said it was something like, was it 90,000 words or over 100?
I'd have to
If you
look
add
at it.
if you had the footnote, I mean, he said like when he said it, I was like, what? He's like, they can squeeze a lot of stuff into that book, into a book. They can do a lot of different things, and obviously, I know we can. Did you have a certain page count you were going for when you were editing?
We approved it at 90,000 words.
Okay.
So we would have had a certain page count, maybe 256 or 272. And yeah, you don't want it to be so big that it's intimidating for people to pick up, right?
Right.
And I think some of the interaction was just, I didn't think he needed to go into all these other areas. In this book, make the argument, and then you can follow up, and that's what he did. But I think we pulled out big chunks of material to kind of try to just focus it on him making kind of the big argument.
How did he respond to that?
Oh, Matt's great. He there was I think I recall a little bit of back and forth, because I think it's, when you're this, and he's, was very invested in this project and this argument, wanted to get it right. And so I think it pained him probably to cut out words, but you're an editorial. Sometimes that's a lot of the job, is trying to help people kind of trim and streamline the argument. But I think the end result he's very happy with. And we've worked with him on 2 other books now, and yeah, he's great to work with.
Yeah.
So he's
sure.
usually pretty receptive to input from the publisher, and so yeah, he's great.
And so it's kind of interesting too. You studied at McMaster's, right?
Yeah. Yep.
You got a PhD. I mean, what did you study?
Right. So I was they have a div college there on campus at McMaster. I did a New Testament degree. My area is Hebrews. So I was a little bit familiar with Matt's work, because he did some work in Hebrews on prosopological exegesis in his early stuff. But yeah, so that's my area, kind of New Testament or later New Testament Hebrews.
For those who for those who aren't necessarily scholars, what's prosopological exegesis?
Yeah, sorry. As I was saying that, I was thinking, I could be wrong. I can't remember if this was his dissertation but he did quite a bit of work on kind of a hermeneutic of reading scripture, I think, in the early patristics.
Yeah. I think it was one of his early books. It was he talked about allegoria.
Yeah, and I think in that he worked quite
Paul's
a bit in
hermeneutic.
Hebrews. Right. So yeah, so I was kind of familiar, but when you write on Hebrews, you're in a pretty small, part of the canon. So
I'm so tempted to ask you. So I will. I'm just going to ask you. Who do you think wrote Hebrews then?
Yeah. I've funny stories about it. I get asked that a lot. I think we don't know. I think
Okay.
I think the general consensus is not Paul, but there has been a lot of work to show it's Pauline in some sense. In that it's circulated from the very earliest, within the Pauline letter collection. So it's Pauline in some sense, if not directly authored. I don't think it was directly authored, but
when I'm feeling optimistic, I'll be dogmatic on that question. I'll say Paul, just because it's like it's a lot harder of a case than that he wrote Ephesians, for example. But anyway, I don't want to detract too much on that. I was just curious. I hadn't I
Yeah.
didn't know you studied Hebrew. So, um, okay, what was your biggest challenge in editing or even managing the process with Salvation by Allegiance Alone?
Yeah. Well, probably the most direct answer is what I've already kind of talked about of trimming it up because it came in quite long. Um, and yeah, I think I had a sense I was new to editing, so I wanted to make sure I got it right. I knew it was like I was it's my first year in that position. So I well and so wanted to make sure I was giving it the attention it deserved, but also knowing um this is a big argument. It's kind of it's kind of like a big swing, right? And if it just wanted to make sure that we got it right, that the T's were crossed. And so I remember having a little bit of feeling a little bit of pressure on wanting to make sure that we got this one right. Um, but yeah, I that said, I mean Matt was very receptive and I think he's a brilliant guy. He's got a lot of ideas. Um, and I think the book, I think it did well out of the gate. Like I think it came out and it kind of made a splash, and so that was very good.
He mentioned that surprised everybody. Like, obviously, you expect a book to sell, but do you remember any early sales numbers?
I don't know. I don't know specific sales numbers. I mean, I would have to look up. Um, but I know that it would have met our sales projection. We set out a 1 year sales projection. I think it hit that like in the first 6 months or something. And I remember there was discussion of, all right, now you've got to go get another book from him. Like this one's taking off. Now let's kind of build on that and get something else under contract. And and we did. We got a 2 book contract with Matt. And so we did Gospel Allegiance. And then his new one is coming out next year. Beyond the Salvation Wars, I think is the title.
So
Um,
yeah, he talked about that. So you garnered both of those at the same time, even though they've been staggered like this.
right. It was intentional. Let's try to get him signed up for 2 books. Um, building on the success of Salvation by Allegiance alone.
But I mean,
So
that's a hot
um,
minute ago. You got those contracted back then, like in what 2015, or I guess it would have been 2017,
something
2018.
like that. Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, and
So
Gospel Allegiance came out. Was that in?
yeah, that was in the Brazos line.
Yeah, was that in 2020? Was that in 2019 or
I
2021?
should have it
I
all in
just
front of
skipped
me.
2020. Like that's not.
Yeah, right. I I think it was pre-COVID.
Hold on, I think I've
So I want
got
to
it. Let me
say
check. Um, yeah, it
but
was
I
20. It was 2019.
okay.
So that one came
Yeah.
out quick, and then it's like, okay, let's wait till what 2024.
Well, he did a couple of books in between, right? He just did
Okay,
the
so did you have the date? I'm just curious. Did you have the date set at that point, or was it like we'll do this one and then we'll set a date for the next one after that?
I don't know if we had a date set, but we had discussion about his queue. Like he has a couple of books under contract elsewhere, and where does this fit? Um, but it speaks to, we saw the strength of the manuscript, we saw it find an audience, and then we were quick to, all right, we got to work more with Matt because he seems to be onto something. And we did make the decision with Gospel Allegiance to do it in our Brazos, which is a bit more trade friendly division.
Yeah, how'd you
Still,
make that decision?
yeah, I'd have to remember. I think Matt um, liked that idea of, he made the academic argument, salvation by allegiance alone. Now he wants to write something that isn't just a rehash. He's talking there about what is the gospel and rethinking against some popular notions of what the gospel is. But it was still coming from the same kind of argument that he's making, and so he made the academic argument, and he wanted to write something that church groups could use, or interested lay people could read. And it's clear that Matt has a heart for the church, and so we were seeing Salvation by Allegiance alone getting picked up in church groups and things. But it's pretty heavy stuff. And so Gospel Allegiance we did in Brazos with the hope of kind of expanding his audience to not just the guild, to kind of beyond. And that one did well as well. And the next one is looking at the Gospel Allegiance model as he talks about it now, applied to issues of justification and salvation. And yeah, it's just kind of he's still kind of thinking through the repercussions of his argument into other areas of theology.
Well, and expanding
Yeah.
it too, right? Because he touches on
Right.
that in Salvation by Allegiance alone.
Right. Yeah.
But so is it fair to say that Salvation by Allegiance alone is sort of I want to say the capstone, but more of the pillar book out of which some of these others have branched? Is that fair to say?
Well, I don't think you have to read Salvation by Allegiance alone in order to read the others, because I think they're each, they're a coherent argument, like Gospel Allegiance. But I think in Gospel Allegiance he does kind of restate that argument because he is going to build upon it, right?
Yeah, he doesn't want to
but
assume that, but
right. But yeah, I think Salvation by Allegiance alone is really kind of where everything kind of branches out from. Um, so yeah, in some ways, yeah.
Um, so as far as publishing with a different imprint,
Yeah.
like how did that change your approach as an editor?
Right. Well, the way we have it set up is Baker Academic and Brazos overlaps a lot in personnel. So the same editors work on both books, the same marketing team. Um, Brazos has actually grown and developed quite a bit since 2019. But we definitely had a lot of conversations about making sure the argument was accessible, including more personal stories, making sure that there wasn't a lot of jargon. And so he's engaging in that book with people like John Piper and John MacArthur, kind of more popular
Yeah, very directly
figures.
too. I
Right.
actually read it with a couple guys, and one guy was like, "I'm not going to keep reading this."
Yeah.
But I think that was his deal. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right.
I felt like Matthew needed to. It's more like, let's talk about my interlocutors directly. Like, let's just
Right.
go ahead and put everything on the table. But yeah,
Right.
that makes sense. I noticed that he really intentionally had some stories in Gospel Allegiance.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, yeah, that was all very intentional of trying to bring the argument down a bit while also kind of expanding what he was doing, but in a way that you didn't have to, be a student in a New Testament class to follow what's happening. So yeah, and it seems like he's continued to kind of, outside of just Baker, continue to kind of flesh out a bit of the Gospel Allegiance thinking. So yeah.
Which of the two, I guess, that have come out with Baker so far would you advise? Like, let's talk about like a pastor or someone in ministry. Which one would you say they should read first, in your opinion,
Right.
to kind of
That's a
get
good-
Matthew Bates? And especially I'm thinking about. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's tricky. I would probably do Gospel Allegiance because that was the audience in mind, was we want to reach
Yeah.
pastors, and so he wrote that, I believe, thinking people who haven't read the first book, how to kind of get them into it with Gospel Allegiance. I think the first book is the one that is kind of my favorite of the two, just because I think at the time it's a novel argument, and I really connected with the translation of pistis, right, and rethinking that. So I thought that was all really, really interesting to me when I read it. But yeah, it's kind of like I think Gospel Allegiance can be kind of your entryway into Matthew Bates's writing, and then you're ready to take on the big one there, the Salvation by Allegiance Alone.
Yeah.
But yeah, that'd probably be my recommendation.
Man, well, I appreciate this, Brian. Is there anything else you wanted to add about Salvation by Allegiance alone?
No, it's one of those, really kind of fun publishing stories. There's books that, yeah, that you like, but don't get the traction that you think they deserve. This was one that was very happy to see it catch on. Thought he was doing something important, so it was fun to see it succeed. And then it kind of started a relationship with Matt that has been really fruitful. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk about this book, and I think it's a good one to highlight because it I think has made quite a bit of impact in scholarship, but also I think within the church and wider conversations about
Yeah.
how to understand, these issues and the gospel and faith. And so yeah, it's kind of one of those success stories that we like to talk
Yeah.
about as much as possible.
Do you guys have sales numbers on Salvation by Allegiance alone?
Um, I could find something for you.
It's 2024 May. Yeah, and even ballpark figures I always find interesting.
Yeah,
Because an
right,
academic book, those don't necessarily sell a ton. I was gonna look up a lot of times I can tell on Amazon by
right,
the reviews.
right,
You can kind of ballpark. I mean, 345 reviews on Amazon.
right.
You know, my guess. Do you want me to guess? Are you looking up the numbers?
Yeah, I guess you can guess if you want.
Well, why don't I guess, and then if you have some numbers, that'd be interesting to see how off I am.
Actually, I'm scared for you to guess because you'll guess too high, and then I'll.
My guess is like 22,000.
Hmm. Yeah, it's not quite there. It's in kind of the upper teens, it looks like.
Okay.
But it's been out not quite a decade yet. And I
I
think
mean,
one of the things that we pay attention to is how it continues to sell.
yes.
Um, and so last year in 2023, it sold the most since the first year, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
which is
so,
interesting.
so what that would be like 7 years later, it had its second best sales year,
It's
which
got
means that
it's got to be
people,
his other titles coming out.
yeah, probably.
I mean, I would guess.
But I think it also speaks to the book itself, that it's continuing, word of mouth, it's continuing to connect. So, in publishing, we think of this, it's a book that's going to backlist well, it's going to sell for a while.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, kind of every rubric we'd have, it's, a success story for us. So, I hope I don't get in trouble for sharing sales numbers. We'll find out. We'll do a follow-up video. Yeah. Well, no, in academic, um, books, a sales projection is usually like if it sells 5,000 in its lifetime, then that's good publishing, from a sales. And so this is, well beyond that, within 8 years or whatever. So yeah, and I think it's one that'll be around, and I think people will continue to engage with it for a long time. So I think it will continue to sell. Maybe we'll do a new edition at some point. Hmm, right. Well, I think Matt did something called the Gospel Precisely, which might have been more trying to do that. Um, but um, but yeah, I mean, we're gonna do his next book, Beyond the Salvation Wars in Brazos. Similarly trying to hit kind of that audience. So
When does it come out?
spring of 25, I think.
Okay. Have you guys
It's in.
done?
I've had it already and I've passed it off, so
Okay.
it's in the editorial process.
Okay.
So if it's not late 24, it's early 25.
Okay.
But you also want to give some time. His Erdman's book just came out this past year, so you want to give a little bit of space to let that, find its readers, and then the next one. So, right, yeah, which I haven't read, but I hear it's very good and has gotten a lot of attention. So, um,
Is the way he sustains an argument is really funny to me because if you're gonna do it different, you got to really do it, But
mhm,
in other words, it was almost like one long argument strung
mhm.
throughout the chapters, where you felt like he was just using chapters to keep you going along, but in a good way.
Gotcha. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it was like
Hmm.
a very complex line of thinking. But that one was even more so, I think. It was smaller in terms of the packaging, but it was even more so for like a church kind of group.
Hmm. Right.
But, well, man, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate you taking time to share a little bit. And I'm excited about the Beyond Salvation Wars.
Beyond the Salvation Wars, I think, is the final
Beyond the
title.
Salvation. Okay. Yeah. That, man,
It'll be the first one without the word gospel in it in a while. So we'll see.
Okay. Going back to
I
the
just mean gospel allegiance. Why the gospel? Gospel precisely.
Well, I've often heard that theology from academia takes 50 years to hit the church.
Uh,
And, there's some, and I'll be honest, I read N.T. Wright, almost 20 years ago now. And it was like, wow, and it was some of this like Jesus and the victory of God and the challenge of Jesus. And it was similar stuff. But for some reason, Matthew Bates' articulation of it was just hit home better for me by far.
right.
And obviously they're saying different things, but overlapping. So I was just really grateful to work with Matthew, like to talk with him, to read his stuff. I edited the Gospel Precisely for the Renew organization.
Yeah. As I was saying that, I was thinking you might have had a hand in that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
He was great to work with. He was different to work with. I found him very engaged in the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
He writes about things that he's passionate about. And he's pretty passionate about these ideas. And so, yeah, he's fun to work with.
Well, yeah. Anyway, just to close the loop, the idea of going back to kind of that word salvation, I just think there's so much right now that needs to be worked out, I think, in the church, and a lot of thinking about these topics. So I'm grateful thanks for your work, man. You probably don't get a lot of thanks very often because as an editor, you're behind the scenes pretty much totally.
Sometimes in the preface I do, so that's nice.
If they remember, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing attention to the book. Yeah. So